for me, the success metric for all of us is, have we been able to shift the global transfer of value to faster, more efficient networks? I gave a talk last week about what I think of as the three phases of money. And for me, Money 1.0 was like Swift, Visa, these traditional bank networks that started to connect counterparties together. And they move a tremendous amount of money at scale, but these are very antiquated technologies that are coming from the pre-internet real-time era, where the settlements have a lot of intermediaries, the settlements are expensive, the settlements are slow. And that created the opportunity for Money 2.0, which is the rise of fintechs, which said, okay, the infrastructure has all these challenges, so we're going to accrue a tremendous amount of enterprise value by creating the illusion that the infrastructure is better. And we're going to create that illusion through pre-funding liquidity in all these different parts of the world. We're going to create that illusion through better UI, UX. We're going to create that illusion through workflow optimizations. But we're all built on the same broken infrastructure. We're just providing those band-aids that abstract the user away from it. And now Money 3.0 is not the band-aid. Now with kind of blockchains and stablecoins, we're finally going back and fixing the underlying infrastructure versus slapping more band-aids on top of it.
Hi, I'm Pelle Braendgaard. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Notabene. I'm joined today by Kevin Lehtiniitty, the CEO of Borderless.xyz.
Thanks, Pelle. Thanks for making the time. It's always a pleasure when you and I get to chat about the world and stablecoins and where the future is heading.
Yeah, we never have a boring conversation. That's for sure. So, so Kevin, I'd like to maybe just dig into a little bit about why you started Borderless.xyz. And also, first of all, maybe explain to everyone, you've built an amazing network, but I'd rather have you explain it than me.
Fair enough. Can I at least give you a quiz on it later?
Yes, for sure.
I've been in stablecoins for the past 9 years, which I like to joke is a really long time to be saying stablecoin adoption is coming next year. And I've seen the industry from a few different perspectives among those 9 years, kind of from an issuer perspective, from a custodian and like collateral management perspective, from a payment rail standpoint. And one of the things that I've always been fascinated by, which will lead into kind of why Borderless is designed the way that it is today, is this juxtaposition of what is a global asset on a global network, i.e. a stablecoin on a blockchain, juxtaposed with things that, in my opinion, will always stay local and fragmented, which is things like regulatory licenses, traditional banking rails, and central bank issued currencies, right? I don't see a world in which we magically have a global banking license next year, or a central bank say, you know what, we're going to step away from Brazilian reals or Indian rupees, and we're just all going to adopt Bitcoin as the global standard, right? So you have this juxtaposition between global and local fragmentation. And I think that means in order to get stablecoin adoption at scale, somehow you have to bridge that gap. And like, that's a very, very interesting opportunity to try to solve. And the way that Borderless has looked at it is we think of stablecoin on and off ramps, right? Whether it's orchestrators or market makers, local liquidity partners, et cetera, as almost the next generation banks and financial institutions. And what for us has been missing is, if you are building on stablecoins at scale, you need to connect to this patchwork of various providers, right? So think the common names are like Bitso in LATAM, Trace Finance in Brazil, Yellow Card in Africa, Bridge in the US, maybe BVNK in the EU. And granted, everyone's expanding right now in this sort of market, but that's kind of been like the traditional flow. And in order to operate across a bunch of geographies, in order to have higher uptimes through like redundancy and better reliability, and in order to optimize the FX rates, ideally, you're transacting across a set of counterparties, not just one platform. And there's a ton of development effort that goes into building all those different API connections and maintaining them. There's a ton of operational effort that goes into now reconciling all of these separate providers and transaction logs And there's a ton of compliance work that goes into like managing the vendor DBQs across all these different pieces. And what we've said is geez, if all of this ultimately connects to the same providers everywhere, then everybody is spending a ton of time and a ton of money building exactly zero enterprise value. This seems like a great thing that could instead be licensed as a SaaS business versus the wheel being rebuilt every single time. Because if you and I both have PSPs and we both integrate Yellow Card's API, my Yellow Card integration does not somehow give me materially different enterprise value than your Yellow Card integration, right? It's commoditized. It's the same connection. It's who the counterparty is. That's the value. So that's what we set out to say with Borderless. Was we said, okay, we don't want to be another provider. We don't want to be another node, if you will, or another on and off ramp. What we want to be is the network that connects all of these on and off ramps together. We want to say, great, you connect to Borderless one time, and then within Borderless, you can enable this whole network of counterparties all around the world that you can transact with. So we're solving the development, lift and maintenance, we're solving the operational fragmentation, and we're solving some of the onboarding pieces. That's really what we set out to fix so that you can go global fast.
Now that makes a lot of sense. Like one of the things we've noticed while starting and talking with design partners like you around Notabene Flow also is that so many companies have essentially been forced to rebuild the correspondent banking system
over and over again,
while specifically trying to, we are working against the correspondent banking system. We are much better than the correspondent banking system. And that's kind of the big irony. Actually, to that, maybe another question I'd like to ask you, we've talked about this and the benefit of what you guys are doing, but where's the real value of stablecoins and for businesses, for end users?
I think there's two places that make a ton of sense. And one is kind of in the holding of value use case, which is where you see this dollarization narrative be quite popular in the near term, which is, hey, stablecoins aren't necessarily popular because they're stablecoins. Stablecoins are popular because they're the US dollar in most cases. And if I'm living in an emerging market with currency volatility and things of that nature, what I want is the US dollar. And a stablecoin is the proxy asset that I can get as an Argentinian or a Colombian or someone like that, someone in Nigeria, to be able to dollarize my savings instead of holding in a local currency. Now, I do think there's a long-term question there on how this turns into a gray market, right? If we forecast this out to the extreme end, you're not going to have central banks and nation states that all of a sudden say, oh, great, we're so happy that our entire economy is now running in USD versus our own central bank issued currency. Let's just get rid of our own central bank currency. So I don't know if we're going to see, import taxes on stables. I don't know if we're going to see forced conversions, but the central bank is certainly not going to lose its grip on its national currency. So there's some long-term questioning there. Then I think the more interesting value proposition is around global payments. And that's where we see a lot more adoption from businesses specifically, where our current banking infrastructure is slow, especially in emerging markets. And it's slow because of the amount of intermediaries that are involved. And I'm not talking about moving money from the US to the EU. I think that's, for now, mostly a solved problem that settles T0 on SWIFT. There's most traded FX pair in the world. But let's think about moving money from Africa to Latin America as an example. The vast majority of those transfers still pass through New York. That makes no sense. What we get with stablecoins is we get a complete graph where you don't need to have an intermediary because we've basically agreed on the ultimate expression of an open banking standard, which is a stablecoin on a blockchain. And as long as I, as the financial institution in Africa, support stablecoins on a blockchain, and I, as the financial institution in Latin America, support stablecoins on a blockchain, and assuming those are, similar stablecoins on similar blockchains, now we can directly settle with each other without that having to pass through multiple layers of a correspondent banking system. And I think that's where you start to get a lot of the cost efficiencies and the speed efficiencies. And ultimately what that means is we can also kind of get back the cost of capital of all the pre-funding that's happening in a lot of these scenarios, which is causing the illusion of real-time money movement. When you can actually move money in real time, now you don't need to have that capex of all the pre-funding to create the illusion anymore.
Pre-funding is such an interesting thing that most people don't realize that's actually, how correspondent banking works and how many of these systems actually work behind the scenes. It's still happening today, even for like whenever you have any kind of fiat integration. So
at scale across corporates, across the biggest PSPs, it's not an optional thing, right? The banking rails do not settle in real time, which means the only way to simulate real-time settlements is to stick pre-funding as a band-aid on top of the legacy banking infrastructure.
I've heard one particular partner in that we've spoken with in Notabene Flow actually say that list all the regulators that they have, and at the final one, like the most important regulator was the banks where they have that they use for pre-funding and for fiat accounts, and it's a nightmare, not just on the economic issues, that you need to have that much, dollar value stored up in someone else's balance sheet, but it's also the risk. What happens? Like you have to make sure that they still trust you and continue trusting you, and that's actually is a major issue that we see as well,
especially in emerging markets, right? When we think of banks from a US centric standpoint, we think of like, JPM and Wells Fargo and US Bank and, kind of the big, too big to fail type banks. And I think even in the US, right, in the crypto world, we've seen Signature, we've seen Silvergate, in kind of the fintech venture world, we've seen SVB, right? It's like, granted, there's a lot of government oversight and trying to make sure assets aren't lost, but even in the US, we're seeing banks fail. Not commonly, but it's a thing. Now, imagine holding a bunch of collateral, and I don't mean to pick a random country, but let's just pick Nigeria, right? Like, what is the regulatory framework if a bank fails in Nigeria, and how much of your capital is tied up in pre-funding there? Banks are not created equal around the world from a risk perspective, and I think that's something people miss.
Yeah, I was at the Stripe event in New York a week or two ago, and I believe the CEO of Remitly, a large remittance company, says that they at a given moment they have $400 million stored in pre-funding at any given moment, which is crazy.
And I think that's really the big unlock of stablecoins. If you think about remittance companies and you think about Treasury and B2B payments, is if you have $400 million of capital locked up in free-funded accounts, imagine if you could actually move funds into a jurisdiction in near real time 24/7. And you don't need to completely eliminate pre-funding. But some of the conversations that we've had with folks is great. They pre-fund 2 to 3 days worth of typical liquidity that they need to region. We're saying, great, if you start to use stablecoins to manage your treasury, you can still pre-fund. Like, you don't have to change your workflow. But now all of a sudden you can top up your pre-funding every 2-3 hours, 24/7, instead of having to hold funds across multiple days. And you can take that $400 million in pre-funding and you can lower that to $50 million of pre-funding, get back the $350 million. And you don't have to change your operational workflows. You can still have, a pre-funded counterparty that's able to then do the real-time movements and things like that. You just manage the treasury of those balances in a real-time money movement way, which massively decreases that. And if you can give 80% of that back to the business, that is massively impactful for their P&L, which is then in terms massively impactful for the end consumer that is subsidizing the P&L costs of these things through the transaction fees, right?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of companies, particularly remittance companies, where they have large outflows on the weekends. And weekends is exactly the time that the banks are closed for business. And the great thing about stablecoins is that they don't close at 6 p.m. Friday evening and open up again 8 a.m. Monday morning. So we can continue to handle these operational issues straight through.
But what about national holidays, Pelle? Does money just magically stop moving on national holidays for stablecoins? It's crazy to me that in this internet connected world that we live in, money just doesn't move sometimes. That's wild.
It is crazy. I think you've sold me on stablecoins, Kevin. So I think I bought into your.
We've sold each other.
I think we agree on this. So one thing that we've seen is that there are several initiatives trying to create closed loop networks. And when I say closed loop networks, these are small controlled groups, and where, let's say, a single company decides who can join the network, they limit who can be part of it, and create a, in theory, a safer, smoother environment for payments. But in reality, outside of very small markets, open loop networks where anyone can join a network and there's no real massive restrictions have kind of won. What are your views on that in the stablecoin world?
We think pretty unequivocally that throughout history, open networks have, maybe on a longer time horizon, but on that long time horizon, have always won against centralized efforts. And I think, to pull a couple examples, we can look at one of the largest payments networks in the world, which was Visa, and the origins of Visa coming from kind of all the banks trying to launch their own competing charge card settlement, etc. type programs. And if you look back at the data, I wish I had a slide that I could show that would be probably more impactful. You can see like the adoption of cards as a global payment method, and you can see how slowly that adoption is trickling as these different banks are all competing with their own bank card programs. And then you can kind of see when the Visa consortium was formed, and we said, okay, there's now a standardization of how we're going to do these things across different counterparties, and it's going to be an open-ish network, right, versus owned by a particular bank like Bancorp or something like that. And then you can see the adoption of cards start to massively take off, and it's this giant inflection point. If we go back to industry, we can see the same thing around railroads. Railroads were not a standardized gauge back when they were created, right? Each railroad company would come out with its own set of standards that were these kind of closed loop ecosystems. And it was like, great, my infrastructure runs on this gauge, your infrastructure runs on this gauge. And the Lightspark team has done a phenomenal job of showcasing some of this in their open network design, building on top of Bitcoin, where they had a wonderful slide actually just yesterday on this topic. And they showed the amount of time and value that was lost in train connections having to unload all of the cargo from one rail line, reload it onto a whole different rail line in order to then proceed. And especially in the US, there was a giant effort to standardize that onto one standard rail gauge. And from that effort on, then all of a sudden, the US economy and the ability to do cross-state commerce massively booms. In the technology world, we can look at things like OSs, right? Let's take a look at Linux. You and I may not be running Linux on our machines here. I'm sitting on a MacBook. I don't know what you're running. But if we look at the cloud, which is actually where compute lives, right? Think about how much compute lives in the cloud versus on your local machine. The vast majority of the cloud is driven by Linux, right? Even Azure, which is Microsoft's cloud, is mostly driven by the Linux operating system. The giant titan of industry that is Microsoft was unable to fight against the open standards and open protocols of Linux when it came to cloud adoption. So I think we see this time and time again throughout history. And for stablecoins, it's going to be no different.
Yeah. I think the Linux analogy is really interesting because it went in and it won that whole market of the cloud, but it's also Linux is what's behind Android, and probably every single device with a CPU in it, which is basically every single device nowadays, right, are also running Linux. So because of the open network and the open approach to it, you can really attack all kinds of different use cases and not just the use case that the promoter of the protocol intended, which I think is very exciting.
With a closed network, the amount of value that can accrue to that network is capped by the value of the network administrator, because the incentives are misaligned such that they flow back to the network administrator. In an open network, the value of the network is capped at the superset of the value of all the participants. And I think that's a very non-obvious thing. And once you start to think about what that actually means, and maybe I'll say it again, on a closed network, the value is capped at the value of the administrator. On an open network, the value is capped at the aggregate sum of the value of all the participants. That is orders of magnitude of difference. That's not a subtle change. So when we think about things like corp chains and when we think about things like issuer driven payments networks, they may be valuable. They may be quite valuable. They may be 10 billion, $50 billion, enterprise value businesses, but they're ultimately capped at what is the value of that stablecoin issuer, because there is no incentive for that issuer to promote its competitors, or for its competitors, even if it did try to promote them, to rely on infrastructure that's owned by someone who's competitive to them. But all of a sudden, when you think about open networks, that's where you get the 500 billion, 600 billion, dollar businesses. If you look at the kind of two main banks that were the driving force behind the Visa consortium, Visa's market cap today is greater than those two banks combined. And that gives you kind of the sense of the size of open networks versus the size of these walled gardens. And I get the temptation to own the infra or to own the network, right? It's a classic rent taker value extraction play of, oh my God, if I can own this, think of how valuable my company will be as the gatekeeper of this thing. But the fact that you're building a gatekeeper is actually exactly what will cap that value, and will make it unable to grow to real scale. And I could drone on about this topic for hours, because this is something that we're deeply passionate about at Borderless, is being a credibly neutral payments network, versus some of the others out there. But that's why we feel so strongly about it.
I think actually, this is the real benefit of public blockchains as well. They are by default open, right? They're open loop. They support many, many different use cases. And it's also the approach that we've taken with Notabene, where with Transact, our core compliance focused product that we built is built on TAP, which is an open messaging protocol, which is completely open. It just has different transaction primitives and different authorization flows. And we build a compliance flow around that in a way where we don't need to know what the use cases are. So we have people that are using us for payments. We have people that are using us for trade settlement, for swaps, this, that, and the other kind of thing. It doesn't really matter. But from a compliance point of view, it's abstracted in a way that we can support any kind of use case on that. And it also allows us to take some of these primitives, combine it in a slightly different way to take our approach for solving B2B payments together with Notabene Flow, using the exact same open network and open messaging protocols. And we also hoping that a lot of innovation comes on top of this TAP messaging protocol, because it's not controlled by us. We may have developed it, but that together with EVM blockchains can create all kinds of new interesting applications. Maybe we tie that into what we're building with Flow, if it makes sense. Maybe it just takes on the life completely on its own, which is also fantastic, right? And if we just try to create a single database with a sign up flow for it, which is kind of what I think the definition of a closed loop network would be, we wouldn't be able to enable that kind of innovation. But that actually also kind of ties the conversation a little bit back to you. You're working with a lot of companies in there, and are there still any missing pieces from an infrastructure point that you're seeing?
There's a lot that we want to build. There's a lot that we want to bring to the network that I think we bring to the network through partners. Our kind of core thesis or the foundational pieces of Borderless's product stack is all this connectivity into these on and off ramps around the world. And the reason that this connectivity is really important to us is we view liquidity between stablecoins and fiat currencies as being incredibly fragmented. And it's because of this juxtaposition of global stablecoin versus local banking rails and fiat currencies and things like that we talked about earlier. So what we set out and said is, okay, how do we connect into as many of these fragmented pockets of liquidity as humanly possible, and then offer that as one coherent network versus all these little fragmented pockets? And I think we've done a good job now. I think we connect into liquidity across 70 plus countries, I want to say. Thank you. And we do that, in the US and in the EU as kind of the traditional established markets that a lot of payments flows originate in or arrive at. And then we connect into the vast majority of Latin America, just over half of Africa. We're now looking at like Southeast Asia as the traditional emerging markets that you then want to connect into, the more established markets of the US and the EU. But really connecting to liquidity is the core product. And what we found, which actually ties into why we're so excited about Flow, is that everything from a stablecoin perspective to date is very push payments focused. And as we all know, as people who have been in the payments world for a little bit of time, the vast majority of traditional payments flows also include pull type models, whether it's retail subscription payments, whether it's automated invoicing, or whether it's just workflows, right? Make it an arbitrary binary workflow. I want to create some sort of a rule set that says, hey, I want to manage my treasury program according to these things, and I want to automate the transfer of these funds around my different accounts. All those require pull capabilities. And that's not something that currently exists in the traditional stablecoin payments landscape, right? I've got tokens that sit in a wallet. The only way that they move out of that wallet is if I, sign a transaction that pushes them out. And this is something that we decided early on was not going to be, borderless IP, but was a massive missing piece. And what we have been trying to find is who the right partner is that we can team up with to bring some of these capabilities to the market. And ideally, if we could design our dream partner, it would be somebody who believes in open networks, and we wouldn't be promoting, a closed loop system into our open networks. And that's, I think, something that we've really found to be missing, and that we're excited to bring to market together.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's something I've been passionate about for a long time as well. You talked about the early days of Visa before, and a very interesting difference between Visa and Swift is that Swift came out of this period of time when all the banks were implementing their first kind of major core banking systems using infamous COBOL that everyone talks about, and most people have never really seen. I'm old enough that in theory I could have coded it, but I've never touched a line of COBOL in my life. But I know people who have. But Swift came as a way of really automating payments and tying payments into the core banking flows for the banks themselves. So it supports those flows, but it didn't do really anything to make it easier for businesses. Now, Visa and MasterCard, they had a very interesting point where they were really trying to enhance business for the merchant. So it was built specifically to solve business use cases, not solve their own internal processes. I mean, part of the reason the Visa network were started was then to solve some of those internal business processes, but the core product itself was focused about solving business use cases, which is why at its core, credit card payments are essentially pull payments, and you can tie them into fulfillment flows, POS flows, all of these aspects of it, where Swift really doesn't do a good job either. And of course, stablecoins on their own, they don't really do that either. And you, in my view, you need an open network for it to actually work. You really need a large network, and for that, it has to be an open loop network. And then you also need trust and kind of context, which is really what you get with a messaging system like what we've built with Notabene. And with that, I'd be interested to hear like what kind of use cases are you most excited by that we can start bringing to stablecoins?
I think, when we think about open networks and we think about payments, it's always a little bit tricky because it's hard to be completely open. So you can be credibly neutral, and we think that's incredibly important. But imagine a world in which you're completely use case agnostic and someone comes and says, great, my use case for your open network is money laundering. You're like, okay, well, no. So there's still kind of compliance rules and things like that you need to be able to abide by. So you need to have, if we think about Visa or we think about Swift as kind of open-ish networks, or kind of as close to open networks as you can get. But I think the point is it's more of a compliance and regulatory gate versus like a corp chain where it's fully centrally controlled by one central place. I feel like that's worth mentioning when we talk about open networks and payments. Otherwise, I'm going to have somebody from my compliance team who's going to be sending me very, very angry emails once this episode airs.
Look, I have the same problem, Kevin, on that particular part, because I do want to talk about open networks. But of course, we do not have North Korean institutions, nor will we have North Korean institutions within this network, just as an example. And we will not, as a company, deal with sanctioned individuals, countries, etc. And nor should anyone really.
But I think in terms of use cases that we're excited about stablecoins, the ability to optimize for this pre-funding, I think that's a giant use case that we care about a lot because of the amount of capital that gets tied up into these pre-funding things. And what's interesting is you can think of that as a treasury function, which is very much what it is in these remittance companies. And then kind of the next natural extension is like, okay, if you can start to move these funds around 24/7 and I can remove some of these pre-funding requirements, then how do I automate these things? You can ask yourself a very, very fundamentally basic question, which is like, great, what I want to do then is start to automate top-ups when we get to certain thresholds. Okay, how do I actually automate these workflows? Now I need to be able to go beyond the just very basic, I log into my crypto wallet and I sign a transaction to move the funds, because what happens if, these balances get low when it's the middle of the night and nobody from the Treasury team is awake, or these sorts of things I think go into a lot of workflow automation is what needs to be built now on top of the liquidity layer that exists. And then, when we think about the merchant use case, this is maybe like the least hot take that anybody's ever shared on a podcast, but just subscription billing. From a consumer perspective, how much value is processed? Whether it's, I feel like the whole world is now a SaaS business, whether it's Netflix, Spotify, or Google Workspace, etc. The amount of subscriptions that I have on my card is absolutely insane. And as we get into, one of the really interesting emerging trends is merchant processing that settles into stables. So we've seen WorldPay, we've seen Checkout.com, we've seen some of the largest processors start to say, wait a minute, we don't need to settle to your bank account anymore. We can actually settle all your merchant proceeds to your wallet in a stablecoin. And now you can run the stablecoin treasury. People have loved that. And then on the other hand, we have companies like Rain that are crushing it on issuing cards that are backed by stablecoin-based spend versus bank accounts. So we have two really interesting products. One lets me take a stablecoin and spend it on a card, and the other one lets me process a card and get it as a stablecoin. I think you see where I'm going with this. Why is the card network, involved? And the answer is distribution. But if you have a consumer, especially in emerging markets, as we're seeing these dollarization use cases become more and more popular, and we're starting to see all these stablecoin neobanks start to have, stablecoin-based balances. If I have a consumer who has stables and I have a merchant who wants to receive stables from the merchant processing, why is that consumer then running through a card to then run back into the merchant's wallet? And the answer is because the card networks have been the predominant way to do pull payments at scale. And I think if you can introduce that pull payment layer directly onto stables, you can start to go into all these things. And I think Stripe introduced something in the past few days, depending on when we publish this episode, that allows for subscriptions to be paid through stables. And I imagine the uptick of that is going to start to be massive when people start to say, wait a minute, I have stables on both sides of this. How do I just settle these things directly? And to be able to do that beyond Stripe and beyond every single person having to reinvent the wheel, and to say, wait a minute, there's an open network that gives you this out of the box if you don't have 5,000 employees to go solve this yourself. And even if you do, is that really the value that you want to be focused on? I think that's going to be really, really interesting to watch over the next year or two as you combine the dollarization narrative with the merchant payments narrative, and we see the card adoption on a daily basis. We see what Rain is doing. We see what Bridge is doing. We see what Reap is doing. Like we see how many companies are getting built on top of that card infrastructure. If we're going from stables to stables, let's just do that directly.
Yeah, let's build a new kind of infrastructure to do that. And I'll say Visa and MasterCard, they built great networks, absolutely great networks, and they also built trust, and they've done a fantastic job doing it. And they have a lot of great initiatives in this space as well. So I'm pretty confident that they'll be part of this solution as well in the future. But it shows what you can do if you build trust and pull payments into the payment product on its own. And then, of course, there are a lot of things that happen behind the scenes. And you mentioned Rain, who's done a fantastic job, of course, on that particular front. Quite a few other companies in the space have also done similar things. And I think getting all of the wonderful infrastructure that's been built, as you said, directly to do stablecoin transactions is going to be very, very key for this. And
it will be.
One aspect of pull payments that I'm really, really fascinated by is that pull payments allow you to tie it into your business flow, right? It's not just I'm going to send some funds somewhere and hopefully it gets reconciled. But pull payments allows you to go in and tie directly into business workflows on both sides of things. And particularly the approach that we've taken with Flow for it is that you can start doing these recurring payments, whether it's from billing systems, subscription systems, meter systems, or directly from accounts receivable to account payable systems. And then pick and choose your PSP or global stablecoin account provider in the middle, and of course have it settled across Borderless.xyz, do the cross-chain and liquidity part of it. All of these things are key, and we've got most of the parts to do this now. So I'm excited what's going to happen over the next few years.
I think workflows is one of the most under-discussed topics. So if I think about payments at scale, let's take stablecoins out of the equation. Just payments at scale. I think there's three fundamental layers of things that I need. The kind of core underlying foundation is the liquidity and transaction settlements, right? If money can't actually move from point A to point B, the rest is kind of irrelevant in a payment workflow. And we think of that from our perspective as like the connectivity into all these different pockets of liquidity that form the foundation of our network. Then I think on top of that, you need to have the intelligence layer, which is, maybe not to preview too many things that are publicly announced yet. That is, the part of the product stack that we're currently spending a lot of time on now, which is things around how do I optimize my FX rates, right? In a world where there's 5 different pockets of liquidity for one particular stablecoin to currency pair, how do I look at those real-time rates between these different pockets? How do I pick which stablecoin to settle on? How do I pick which blockchain network may be more advantageous to me or not? And then, how do the worst thing that you can find out as a PSP is that you have some sort of a provider downtime from your customers, right? The last thing you want to learn about is like, wait a minute, our PIX transfers are down and I'm learning about it from a provider, from a customer complaining on X, right? How do we bring intelligence like real-time provider monitoring to be able to say, hey, flag Mr. PSP, this particular provider that you're using to do your stablecoin to PIX transfers is currently experiencing issues. do you want to automatically reroute all these payments to these other providers that we know is functioning well, right? That's kind of like the intelligence layer that sits on top of liquidity. And then the ultimate unlock sitting on top of these two things is one, can I have the liquidity? And then two, can I have the intelligence to make it reliable and low cost? And then it's all about workflows. Once I can have these reliable, low cost payments all around the world, how do I now automate this and tie this into all of my existing business processes? And I think that is the unlock that is effectively then the distribution of this global, low cost, reliable payment network.
That's amazing. I love that. I think we're getting to the end here, but I always like to ask, like 5 years from now, what does success look like for Borderless.xyz, for the industry, for Notabene Flow, all in context?
It's a good question. And the reason I really like this question is because I think in the stablecoin world, we are in, unfortunately, compressed time horizons, where there's a lot of people that are thinking about what they can do in 6 months, in 12 months, in 24 months. But driving real industry-wide change in payments is a 5-year, or we often think of it as a 10-year battle. And I think there's a lot of, I call them the stablecoin tourists that have come to the space now that it's hot. And, they want to build billion-dollar exits in 2 years. And some probably will, in all honesty. That is probably achievable in this market. But is that really going to have lasting foundational change? For us, when we think of Borderless and the answer that I'm sure our VCs would want me to give is that success for us means that we've built $1 trillion company that is, the king of the world and all those different things. But really, for me, the success metric for all of us is, have we been able to shift the global transfer of value to faster, more efficient networks? Have we fundamentally solved the ability to move money at the speed of the internet? Or are we still in multi-day settlement, $400 million for Remitly of pre-funding? Are we still in the Band-Aid phase? And I gave a talk last week about what I think of as the 3 phases of money. And for me, Money 1.0 was like Swift, Visa, these traditional bank networks that started to connect counterparties together. And they move a tremendous amount of money at scale, but these are very antiquated technologies that are coming from the pre-internet real-time era, where the settlements have a lot of intermediaries, the settlements are expensive, the settlements are slow. And that created the opportunity for Money 2.0, which is the rise of fintechs, which said, okay, the infrastructure has all these challenges, so we're going to accrue a tremendous amount of enterprise value by creating the illusion that the infrastructure is better. And we're going to create that illusion through pre-funding liquidity in all these different parts of the world. We're going to create that illusion through better UI, UX. We're going to create that illusion through workflow optimizations. But we're all built on the same broken infrastructure. We're just providing those Band-Aids that abstract the user away from it. And think about how many billions and billions and billions of dollars of companies exist out there that are this Band-Aid layer over the traditional kind of money movement network. And now Money 3.0 is not the Band-Aid. Now with kind of blockchains and stablecoins, we're finally going back and fixing the underlying infrastructure versus slapping more Band-Aids on top of it.
Yeah.
And my success metric is incredibly simple. Is like, have we actually done that? Right? Is money actually now flowing at scale on this new money layer versus these traditional payments networks? And if we've done that successfully, then I'm not really concerned about what happens to Borderless as a business or what happens to Notabene as a business or anything like that. If we've successfully done that, that is such a large market that we will all, from a corporate standpoint, be in very good places.
Amazing, Kevin. I am so thrilled that we have you guys at partners in crime. I'm not sure you're supposed to pay that in payments.
Maybe crime is not the right word in payments, but
that, because we share the exact same vision here. Our goal with Notabene, since we founded the company, was to get crypto into the everyday economy, and that means payments and get it in there. Exactly, we share your vision completely on that front. So thanks so much, Kevin. I really appreciate your time here. It was a fantastic conversation, as always.
It's always fun to chat. Thanks, Pelle. We're excited to be part of Flow.